as soon as he would arrive. It's 11:10, and as I said, it's all about lunch. So that's a problem. Okay, so
Okay.
21 point.
I will be less, and I'll explain in a second why. So, welcome, thank you for coming. My name is Ben Herzog. For those who still don't know me, I think all of you know me. I'm a sociologist, and I'm a faculty member here in the Institute. So I'll start with some, not apologies, but some remarks about my work and why it's a bit different than, I think, most of the talks we heard until now. First, because what I understood from Paula when she requested us to bring topics to the workshop is to give proposals, studies we want to have the following year, and so I thought about a proposal of work I want to do.
More than fun.
Yeah, but if you said it's 30%, I'm not sure I'm even there. So it's very much a proposal, which I want also your feedback, and so this is one difference. I'm not coming here with a regular talk, which I know the results of the study because I didn't do the study yet. The other difference is that I'm going to talk my talk rather than read my talk, so it might be a bit different. Okay, so I'll start with the title and explaining a bit what I'm attempting to do. So the title is Transnational Acts of Citizenship, or Why Non-Israelis Choose to Serve in the Israeli Defense Force. So I want to look on this phenomenon, which I will show you. I think it's a new phenomenon, and try to explain it within the context of theories about citizenship and more changes in the way different societies, even Israel, but especially North America, understand the idea of what is to belong to a state or a nation. And I'll explain why I'm using both. So I'll begin with just the premises of what I'm looking at, and I'm looking on action of people. Following the idea of symbolic interaction theory that centers on the idea that actions are based on meaning. So there is a relationship between what people do and the meaning they give to those acts. And specifically, I would look on acts which I called citizenship acts. And why I call them citizenship acts? Because unlike most, we make millions of acts each day, but there are some acts that were perceived by society, by us, get the meaning as connected to our national membership or our citizenship status. So those there are certain acts which are more connected to or present meaning as being connected to our national membership. And okay, so to start the study, and specifically which acts I'm going to look at is serving in another country, this army. And specifically in this study, I want to interview Americans or North Americans, whether Canadians or Americans, who serve in the IDF. And in a way, I think this act, I wasn't sure it would have happened when I saw the program of the conference, but actually this issue fits very well many of the formal discussions we had here, but also the informal debates and we had over dinner and over in other settings about what does it mean today in different countries to be a citizen, to be part of a national community. And I would argue, and exactly I want to situate this act of serving in another army or serving in the IDF, specifically in this moment which ideas are changing. It's not clear what, if maybe 50 years ago or more, it was very clear what it means to serve in another country's army, about your identity, about your belonging. Today it's less so, and this is exactly what I want to explore. Okay, so go. So my first part, I want to persuade you that we're actually talking about a new phenomenon. And it's not clear, because we know, for example, even in the history of Israel, but we know it all over around the world, that people, there were a certain amount of people, not many, always was not many, that served in other countries' armies. Whether it was for ethnic reasons, whether it's like a war of independence, the Machal, there were like about 3,000 or 4,000 soldiers who came from abroad to serve in the IDF. But we know from other conflicts, whether the civil war in Spain, that people came because maybe ideological reasons, or we talked about before about Americans who go to join Daesh in Syria, people who actually cross those national boundaries or symbolic boundaries, not really symbolic, both symbolic and real boundaries. And so it did happen before. I would actually want to argue that it's a new phenomenon. And why this is so. First, you can actually, maybe you can argue that it's a new phenomenon because the numbers are a bit bigger today. It's not, there is a constant, for example, in the IDF, there are constant flow of Americans or non-Israelis, let's go, non-Israelis who come to serve in the IDF. It's hard to estimate. I'll show you exactly why it's hard to estimate exactly, and of course the military doesn't give numbers of exactly how many soldiers come from abroad, but we do know that from, a bit connected to the last talk about NGOs which deal with those soldiers, they present numbers of how many people they helped, how many soldiers they helped. What we called lone soldiers. So we know that there are about hundreds of, and this is also the official, what the Ministry of Defense says, there are hundreds of people of non-Israeli who come to serve in the IDF. They can do that because the IDF, although it's an army, mandatory for all the citizens, or supposedly, if you're a non-Israeli, you can serve in the IDF only if you're Jewish. You can volunteer to the IDF. And the estimate is that, well, okay, this is the next point I want to make, why it's new. Serving in another country's army was always, especially in Israel, was always presented as something, as a step toward integration, assimilation, especially if in Israel, if you wanted to come to Israel, to immigrate to Israel, one of the first things you wanted to do is maybe join the army as a symbol of complete assimilation. But what's interesting about this today is that many of the non-Israelis do not want to come to Israel or to get citizenship or to assimilate. They come after college or before college. They come for 3 years, do or less, make the army, serve in the military, and then go back. And they have no intention, even before or afterwards, to stay in Israel. It's not a part of the traditional story of going from one country to another, but it's living in Canada, for example, going to serve in the IDF and then going back. Again, it's small numbers, but I think this is something which is a new phenomenon. I wanted to actually show you like the numbers. And this is this organization for lone soldiers who treat those soldiers who are without their families. I think they say they treat about 6,000 soldiers a year, but well, I don't know why the English version is very different than the Hebrew version, but most of the, with half I would argue, at least from the Israeli version, the Hebrew version, sorry, is they're lone soldiers not because they come from abroad, they're Israelis, but their families are abroad. So it's not that we don't know from those 6,000 how much are actually people who come from abroad, or how many of them are Israelis, or how many of them are non-Israelis. It's not a data that is given. Okay, so going, I have time. But the main difference, I would argue, is what's a contextual, difference. In a way that we understand citizenship different. So in the past, the national perception of not always ethnic, but was the hegemonic understanding of the world. Today we have a non-national or multinational understanding of citizenship. In the past, the idea, this is one of the debates I think we had here, between the word and the concept of citizenship, whether it's the same as a nationality. In the past, it was understood that it's the same topic, or it should be at least the same issue. So citizenship should reflect your official status, should reflect your identity. So one of the most important, at least what in my sense, important aspect of this citizenship was that it should have been exclusive. You should only have one identity. If you're Israeli, you're Israeli. If you're Canadian, you're Canadian. You cannot be, you have multiple identity or dual citizenship. And actually most of the countries in the world, including Israel, including Canada, including the United States, most democratic countries have laws that said that you are not allowed to do those, what I call citizenship acts. You were not allowed to vote in another country. You were not allowed to serve in another country's army. You were not allowed to even leave for more than I think 7 years in another country. The list is long, and of course you were not allowed to get citizenship in another country, and all those actions were punished in a way by what's called revocation of citizenship. The countries could take your citizenship away. So my project here is to look on how those soldiers understand their act or give meaning to their act in a time when it's no longer like that. It is allowed, it's acceptable to make citizenship acts in other countries, but I'm still not sure whether, and it's also connected to the debate, the discussion we have yesterday with the interfaith dialogue, whether it's an issue of academic, intellectual elites who engage in such processes, or actually it's ordinary people, or I don't know how you call it, the common people, would also can or do engage in such discourse. So as I would argue it's the same here. Whether this multinational, cross-national beliefs that in the academia are evident in theories about citizenship exist, do they also happen in the daily lives and decisions of the people themselves? And this is why I'm going to do, I thought about doing interviews of those soldiers, and which make big acts, I would argue that unlike many of the other actions we do, it is considered like a big decision to go abroad and to serve in another country, but also it's very significant because it's an act that previously was not allowed. So I think it would be as important to look at those people and how do they understand. Do they have an idea that, yes, the world today is changing. Today it's not a problem to serve in another country's army. It's not a problem to go back and forth between national identities. Or they explain their behavior in other ways. So I don't have the answers, but this is exactly what I'm going to check. Whether those philosophical or intellectual understanding that the world is becoming denationalized, transnationalized, is actually happening in the people themselves. Do you have time or finish? Oh, yeah.
No, you're okay. You have.
Do I have time? 4 minutes.
4 minutes.
No, I'm not going to get there. I told like. So going back, so yes, there are those cross-national and multinational understanding of citizenship, but it's not clear that it happens for the average person. And I have, maybe the discussions we had, I have some doubts whether it's really, the ordinary person doesn't still understand the world in national, from a national perspective rather than a post-national. And this is also connected to the title, I think, of the conference, and what is the difference between, at least in the discussions I had here, what is the difference between studying Israel from here and studying Israel from Canada, is the fact that exactly that, this transformation to the post-national order, we are still embedded within a very ethnic and national world order, and while Canadians, for example, at least some of you I spoke with, are very much embedded in a post-national and multinational world order, and this affects the way we understand different situations or imagine different situations. So that's it. I don't. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben. And different perspective.
Yeah.
Tal-Or. Floor is yours.
Yeah.
So I'd like to thank the organizers for providing this platform for us to have these fruitful discussions.
Can you raise your voice a bit?
Yes, of course. And similarly to Ben, I think that my research on this subject matter is very much in the preliminary stages. And through my research, I actually found contrary information to my original thesis, which I think is great. But definitely this research needs more development, and I look forward to that. So with that, I'll begin. In a special issue of the History of Photography, edited by Yishuv, he lamented that, quote, modern Israeli photography has not yet been subjected to a comprehensive scholarly research, end quote. In the journal, published in 1995, a portfolio of 6 Israeli photographers was produced to reflect a representation of the practices in the country. 3 photographers were specifically highlighted as reflecting the first generation of photographers trained in America. They are Simcha Sherman, Micha Kirshner, and Avi Ganor. Nir would not be the first to identify the trend of American influence on Israeli photography production. Other Israeli photography scholars, such as Guy Raz and curators Nissan Perez and Vivian Silver-Brody, all identified Israeli art photography as coinciding with the return of graduates from American post-secondary institutions. Many of these graduates were either new immigrants to Israel or Israelis studying abroad. Together, they created photography departments in established art education institutions such as Bezalel or at the University of Haifa. The significance of educational institutions to art production was explained by Gila Tal-Or in 1986, as she stated, quote, Israeli photography came about in the early 70s with the establishment of photography schools and the introduction of photographic studies in art schools. The importance of photographic studies is not only in that they produce generations of photographers, but because photographic education has implications in the creation of an audience influenced by photography. And thus, it has taken a role in shaping the awareness of the general public, end quote. Tal-Or's assertion of the weight of an educated audience is frequently seen throughout the history of Israeli art production. Before the founding of the State of Israel, the Zionist movement, for example, focused on educating a public in a vision of art that would feed the energy of the organization and reconstitute a Jewish identity. This can be seen in the establishment of Bezalel. Art historian Margaret Olin stated that, quote, the Bezalel School is routinely cited as the founding institution of Israeli art, end quote. The school was established in 1906 as an institution focused on crafts. It underwent several closings and openings due to financial and philosophical changes. In 1965, the institution became the Bezalel Academy of Art and Design. At the same time, the school's study collection merged with several other collections to form the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. This connection between school and display institution solidified Bezalel as a key creative force in Israel. The importance of Bezalel, or a school that would represent and create the imagined identity of Israel, was recognized early by Zionist members. Imagined nationalism draws upon the ideas of political scientist Benedict Anderson, who defines nation as, quote, an imagined political community and imagined as both inherently limited and sovereign, end quote. This, Anderson explains, is due to the fact that while members of a nation will never know their entire communities, they imagine that they are all connected. In order for this to occur, a collective must come together under an imagined shared identity, frequently aided by symbols or a stylistic movement. Ashel Tzvi Hirsch Ginsburg, known as Echad Ha'am, one of the founders of the cultural Zionist movements, proclaimed in his text, B'chiat HaRuach, that, quote, one art school is more important than 100 settlements, end quote. Clearly then, the history of art and its education have deep roots within not only Israeli art movement's tradition, but also the imaginings of the emerging country. The history of photography as a distinctive artistic medium in the country, however, is less developed. Short histories have been established most notably by Guy Raz and Nissan Perez. American influence is frequently identified as being felt when photography is examined as an independent medium used for creative expression. This is not to say that artistic photography did not exist in the country prior to this period, rather that institutional support and establishment of a viable market for photography as an art only occurred during the 1970s and 80s. A case study example of the impact of American considerations of the medium can be seen in the documentation of the Israeli Photography Biennale 1986, held at Mishkan Laomanut Museum in En Herod. According to Guy Raz, the exhibition would mark one of the first attempts in Israel to establish a collective style of personal or artistic photography. The Biennale was organized by Gila Bar-Or, Avraham Elat, Avi Ganor, Margalit Gutman, Yona Fisher, Micha Kirshner, and Simcha Sherman. Out of the 7 collaborators, only 2 studied in Israel. The others studied abroad. It is significant that while the organizers were Israeli, the central catalog text was composed by an American, Alan Koltz. He was tasked with defining what Israeli photography was and predicting a trajectory for its future. Koltz at the time was an associate professor of photography at Pratt Institute in New York, as well as the director of the Photo Collect Gallery, indicating an active role in the dissemination and production of photography. His essay can be seen as aiding to the legitimization of the catalog and selected works through international and more specifically, New York art scene recognition. Further grounding in American influence is seen in the selection of references to American photographers, curators, or critics. For example, John Sarkowski's 1966 publication for MoMA's exhibition, The Photographer's Eye, is used as a means of introducing, quote, the most intelligent and readable discussion of the implications of pure photographic image, end quote, implying that the understanding of photographic medium was reliant on American definitions. Furthermore, New York-based art critic A.D. Coleman's understanding of the photographer's intentional compositional arrangement, or directorial mode, is used to describe growing trends in photographic works. Notably, neither Bar-Or nor Koltz, the authors of the exhibition essays, make references to the works on display in the exhibition or photographers selected for the Biennale. The text instead can be read as a set of goals or desires of outcomes motivated by such an organized exhibition, including the creation of an audience, documentation of local photographic production, and development of photography pedagogical models, notably inspired by Americans such as Sarkowski and Nathan Lyons. American photographic educator and curator Nathan Lyons' legacy is widely felt, most significantly as the founder of Visual Studies Workshop, a graduate school in Rochester, New York. The school focused largely on theory, and the students were expected to gain technical skills in the medium from each other. This was contrary to the traditional goals of photography schools, where classes focused on technical aspects of the mediums, such as courses addressing the zone system. Training students to produce ideas rather than images can be seen as an aspect of the emergence of postmodernism, which placed an emphasis on the concept rather than the valorization of the medium. Additionally, Lyons worked as associate director at the George Eastman House, a photography museum with a significant collection. It is from this collection that Beaumont Newhall wrote The History of Photography in 1937, a textbook which was frequently used as an English introduction to the history of the medium, republished in 5 editions over the span of 50 years. The impact of the text was also felt worldwide as it was translated into several languages. The Eastman Museum was so influential to photography world that there was a period in which it was required to partake in an internship or a workshop in order to be accepted as an expert in the field. Former curator of photography of the photography department at the Israel Museum from 1977 to 2013, Nissan Perez, for example, spent time at the Eastman House. American influence on the Israel Museum's photography collection, however, runs deeper, as the collection was formed under the American photographer Arnold Newman. He continued to work closely with the department through the Friends of Photography Department program. Perez, for his part, was critical in the development and documentation of Israeli photographic history. He achieved this through the production of exhibition catalogs. Significant projects include Timeframe, A Century of Photography in the Land of Israel, Made to Order, and Dateline, Israel, New Photography and Video Art. The direct impact of American photography pedagogical approaches can be seen through the graduates who returned to Israel to educate and formulate central locations of photography production in the country. Yosef Cohen, for example, was born in New York in 1945 and immigrated to Israel in 1971, after completing his studies in photography at the Rochester Institute of Technology. Soon after settling in Israel, he became one of the founding lecturers hired for the photography department at Bezalel. The school would become the first university to open a photography program in 1973. Cohen's understanding of photography was profoundly influenced by Edward Weston's conceptualization of the medium as a mode of discovery, an ever-evolving process of learning to see. This marked a shift in emphasis of photography from a technical tool to that of expression of the subconscious, from the product to the concept. Other American graduates on the faculty of Bezalel included Kent Lester, Avi Ganol, and Simcha Sherman. In 1978, the Midrasha for Art in Herzliya and Ramat HaSharon began under the guidance of Micha Kirshner, a graduate of School of Visual Arts in New York. These faculty members also worked as curators, as can be seen in the example of Avi Ganol, who studied photography at Pratt and San Francisco Art Institute. Oded Yedaya, thank you, born on Kibbutz Chatina, studied at the School of Visual Arts and returned to Israel to develop the photography department in the Camera Obscura School of Arts in Tel Aviv, and taught photography at Haifa University. Much like American photographic educators, Israeli educators of the medium were motivated by the ability to earn a steady income while producing independent work. Similarly, the growth in photography education through higher education led to a rise in the recognition of the medium at large in both Israel and America. Since the early 1990s, many of the notable Israeli art photographers have graduated from Israeli photography institutions. While producing this study, I focused on Israeli reviews of the history of photography in the country. All of them identified trends in the history of photography as correlating with different waves of immigration. For example, when migration from Eastern Europe was prevalent, it was followed closely by a wave of Soviet-stylized photographic production. Therefore, while American influence may be felt in the establishment of museum departments or educational institutions, this may have less to do with American art provincialism than with a wave of American immigration. I would argue that this migration to American institutions could have also been motivated by Israeli response to economic stressors of the period and a disillusionment with the geopolitical climate post the Six-Day War. Additionally, prior to the mid-1970s, there were little opportunities to study photography in Israel aside from workshops or apprenticeships. Furthermore, I would question the simplistic narrative of single-way American pedagogical influence. Notable Israeli photographer Micha Bar-Am, for example, was largely self-taught and developed while working as an army photographer for the IDF, yet was active in American photography networks. In 1974, he was one of the founding members of the International Center of Photography in New York. The institution was both a photography museum and school training many American photographers. Bar-Am's integration into the social network of American photography can be seen in his inclusion in Mike Mandel's 1975 series, Baseball Photographer Trading Cards. The work produced by Mandel as a graduate student traced the tightly knit photography field at the period when it was becoming increasingly difficult to break into the photography network. While Bar-Am was active in the States, he continued to support the development of Israeli photography. This would be felt in his organization with Cornell Kappa of the Israel the Reality, a 1976 exhibition for the Jewish Museum in New York. Along with the exhibitions, Bar-Am also developed Israeli photography trajectories through his founding of the photography department in the Tel Aviv Museum of Art in 1977. He continued to act as curator and advisor until 1997, aiding in the establishment of the photography collection. Simultaneously, Balaam also operated as a consultant for the Israel Museum's photography department. Thus, Balaam can be seen as an example of the transnational link between the two nations, leaving significant marks on both photography scenes. Additional muddying of this singular line of influence can be seen with the various graduates of Bezalel, including Eleanor Karushi, a 1995 graduate who became a faculty member of the School of Visual Arts Photography Department, creating a cyclical relationship with the institution which trained many of the early Bezalel educators. In 1974, Terry Smith, art historian and critic, wrote a text on the provincialism of the contemporary art world. He explained that, quote, "It is inescapably obvious that most artists the world over live in art communities that are formed by relentless provincialism. Their worlds are replete with tensions between two antithetical terms: a defiant urge to localism, a claim for the possibility and validity of making good original art right here, and a reluctant recognition that the generative innovations in art, the criteria for standards, quality, originality, interest, forcefulness, etc., are determined externally. Provincialism, in fact, produces highly self-conscious art obsessed with the problem of what its identity ought to be," end quote. By this, Smith was arguing that defining a local art production separate from the established art world, which was typically monopolized by metropolitan cities, often produced works which simply fell into a new web of stylistic constraints. I would argue that while claims to American provincialism may be made in the case of Israeli photography development through institutional support, these lines may be blurred between provincialism and the impact of social networks. Art photography during the 1970s and 1980s was still largely marginalized within the established art world. This led to the formation of a strong network of photographers who worked together to help establish the field at large. These personal links existed in the social realm, not the geographic. People moved fluidly across international borders, leaving traces transnationally. Returning to Yoshua Neal's complaint about the state of the field, I would agree. Indeed, little formal studies have been conducted about the history of the medium in Israel. Perhaps his frustrations, however, should instead center along the lines of how Israeli photography would be defined, and which figures or styles may have been left behind by the marketplace due to the largely American-defined field. Additionally, I would argue that the difficulty in establishing just what Israeli art photography may be is heavily impacted by the challenges of defining the imagined understanding of Israeli nationalism, a community whose population is constantly shifting across social networks and impacted by waves of aliyah.
In the meantime, Ofer arrived, Ofer Shiff arrived, and in a heroic, I have to say, heroic effort, coming all the way from Tel Aviv to Beersheba teaching, and then coming to Sderot, and then you have to be in the afternoon in Eilat, we have plans there. Anyhow, so the floor is yours, Ofer. Please take place to Ofer. One of the interesting things about this panel is that it breaks historical outlines. The whole idea is that time doesn't matter in this panel. What matters is the principle of here and there. That's what matters in this panel. In a way, this panel, more than any other panel, fits into the title of this seminar, Convergence or Divergence, Visual Studies from Here and There. So, directly to the 1930s.
So good afternoon. First, I want to apologize for just arriving, not being here on the first day. I came back from this weekend sick, so I couldn't be on Sunday, and today I'm teaching. So it's first my apologies. And the whole idea of this coming together from Canada, from the two two sides of the ocean is really to have some discourse. How do we see differently that the topics that we are all involved in, and in a way, how much of the fact that we are here, whether the here is here in Israel or in Canada, affects the way we understand, we analyze what we choose to research in the larger field of Israel studies. And in a way, that is also the topic of my lecture today. More than a lecture, it's a series of questions. So you will excuse me if it's not that systematic. It's the way I plan it is to share with you the way I understand or I cope with a few difficulties in my own research regarding the 30s. So if you, the larger question is, to what extent the Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine, understood what happened in Europe. Now I'm talking about the 1930s, before the Holocaust, this decade, until 1939. And on the surface, you look at Yishuv newspapers, and that is my main primary sources, the newspapers of the Yishuv, and there are many, all sorts, from all political views. I did a systematic research on all of them, religious, secular, right-wing, left-wing, whatever, English, Hebrew, not Yiddish, because there were not many in Palestine on that day. So on the surface, you look at the newspapers of the Yishuv, and every page, from the front page to the last one, they are full with information about what is happening in Europe. The question still, how do they understand what is happening there? To what extent they understand? To what extent they share the dilemmas, the agendas of the Jews in Europe? To what extent Jews who are here with all the challenges of building a sovereign Jewish society can share the dilemmas, the agendas of the Jews in Europe, who have a completely different setting, different realities, different difficulties. The way I chose to examine this question is I looked for something that for me would define the agenda of European Jews at that time. And very quickly I discovered, by looking at the newspapers, that it has a name, a title. The title is Ghetto Benches. Now, for me, it was a new title, a new term that I had to teach myself what it means. But I have to tell you that if you look at the newspaper of the Yishuv at that time, and we have this site called JPress, so you can do all kinds of searches there. So if you push ghetto in all sorts of, in different, with a tet, with a taf, with a aleph, without a aleph, in plural and singular, you get about, at that period between that decade before the war, 29 to 39, a few thousand, let's say about 2,000 mentions of the word ghetto. Out of that, about 50% is ghetto benches. That's a lot. So what is ghetto benches? Ghetto benches, the original meaning is Eastern Europe, Poland, 1945 to 1949, 1935 to 1939, in the universities there, in the beginning unofficial, and then it became an official policy of segregating Jewish students from non-Jewish students. Meaning there is no wall it means discrimination. It means that all Jewish students must sit on the left side, while the non-Jews have to sit on the right side. But very quickly you see that even before that policy was enacted, there are many other sorts of ghetto benches. It's more like a generic term. You will have ghetto trains and ghetto buses and ghetto beaches and ghetto schools and ghetto restaurants and every place, and ghetto chambers for Jewish lawyers and so on and so on. It means that in every place there is a segregation, a separation between Jews and non-Jews. It will be called ghetto benches or ghetto something, ghetto as an adjective. For me, that terms represents the main agenda of diaspora Jews, or rather the struggle against this sort of discrimination represents the agenda of European Jews during that decade before the Nazi period. After that period, there are new games, new rules, and a new research. But right now, we are talking about the decade before September 1939. And through these ghetto benches, you could really sense the struggle, the agenda of East European and Central European Jews. The question how that is being filtered through the Yishuv press. Now, what is the agenda of European Jews before we are talking about the Yishuv? If you look at the information about ghetto benches, both in the Yishuv press, but also in other sources, in American press, in European press themselves, how European Jews represent it, how they're quoting themselves, it's a struggle with an optimistic assumption that the norm, the desired norm, is equal rights for Jews and non-Jews. And you should fight for it. And if you fight for it, there is a chance that you will win. So this is a big question. Do the Yishuv articles, reporters that report on that agenda, how do they treat it? Do they share this optimism? Don't they? So that is the main question. How do they report about it? How they interpret about that struggle against the ghetto benches policy on all its sorts in different countries? And what I will tell you today is more question than a systematic answer. Of course, there is not one systematic answer for that. So, as I say, about 50% of the mentions of ghetto in the Yishuv press are talking about the struggle of European Jews against different types of ghetto benches policies, whether we are talking in the universities or other sort of discrimination, separate places in the trains, separate restaurant or separate seats in the restaurants, and so on and so on. But the articles, all of them, I can tell you, first of all, they focus on the struggle, the Jewish struggle against this policy. And as you look it through, the first thing that is impressive to me, even before saying anything that would say how they perceive this struggle, whether they agree with it or not, is that I was looking for the articles geographically. What are the locations in the Yishuv press that mention the ghetto benches policy in Europe? And you get, like, if you would have a map it will be filled with red dots. I mean, it's like almost every Jewish community in Europe would be represented in these reports. You get a sense that the readers of the Yishuv Press really utilize this ghetto benches policy, at least to read, to be connected with something that happens there in Europe. It's almost an intimate conversation with specific concrete places that the Yishuv Jews themselves or the family came from. So really you have, first of all, a feeling of some intimate conversation between the readers in the Yishuv and the Jews in Europe through this mention of different locations where this benches ghetto benches policy is happening. The second thing, when you read the reports in the Yishuv Press, you get a very clear picture of us against them. The us is the Yishuv people, or at least writers of these different articles, and the Jews in Europe. The them is not simply the non-Jews. It's not. It's us, the Jews of the Yishuv, the Jews of Europe, and all the forces of progress. The them is all those forces of the dark reaction, of the dark fascism, Nazism, racism, and whatever. It's clearly the Yishuv with European Jews, with the forces of progress against the forces of evil, including anti-Semitism, fascism, and whatever. I want to share with you just a few examples that you will get a sense of it. A quote in the Yishuv Press of a Polish scientist who stood heroically in front of the students and say the following: before the independence of Poland, we all believed in the incredible force of the Polish people. And now I have to say with deep sorrow that we are wrong. If so easily we get we let those waves of hatred to spread among us, we don't deserve our independence. Another professor stands, and all those are quotes in the Yishuv Press, and you get a sense what is important for them to tell the Yishuv readers. So another professor, non-Jew, speaking to his students, and he says, I'm talking to you among my students who still have some human conscience. If I was younger, I would stand now with the Jewish students on the separate side. I would fight with them in order to try to erase the disgrace, the ghetto disgrace from Poland, from Polish culture, and so on and so on. Quotes like that, and mind you, most of the quotes of Polish professors were not like that. It was the Yishuv Press that chose to emphasize specifically those quotations. There are many also quotes that emphasize the judicial struggle. Polish Jews who go to the courts and try to fight against this benches policy, ghetto benches policies. Many of those. And again, every little win, and there were tiny wins, tiny victories. Every victory like that is being emphasized and get you could see that there was a school called the Wallenberg Technion in Warsaw that was established by Jewish philanthropists. It was established a few decades before, and when they established it, the bylaws of that institution that no discrimination is allowed. Now, that was one of the first schools that did this segregation between Jews and non-Jews. And the son of the philanthropist who established the school sued the Polish government. And the Polish government, in the beginning, in 1936, abolished the ghetto benches policy. And you could see in the newspaper of the Yishuv what cries of joy, and all of them were talking as if we won the war, we, the Jews. You continue to read those newspapers and you get a clear sense that this notion that Jewish normalization include equal rights among the non-Jewish society, this is a legitimate notion that is being supported or at least accepted in the Yishuv press. And the way you get a sense of that is when you see what is the threat, how they talk about the threat that the ghetto benches policy represent. The threat is that if this policy would succeed, the ghetto benches policy, we Jews will not be considered as human beings, as equal human beings. And that will be the end of the world. If you read those articles, mind you, that is before 1939, before Auschwitz, if you want. They don't talk about physical extermination as the biggest threat. But if you read carefully the articles about the ghetto benches policy or against the about the struggle, the Jewish struggle against that policy, you get a sense that the biggest threat for Jews is that Jews will not have a legitimate place in the world as part of the non-Jewish society. And that is in the Yishuv press. I'm looking for a quotation, just that you will not think that I'm just inventing it. Here it is. For example, there is a memo of the Vad Leumi after the Nuremberg laws, and it says, the Hebrew people participate for many generations in the creation of human culture in all its branches. We, the Jews, acquire in our civil loyalty the right for civil equality, including the people, and will not let anyone take it from us. My translation. Nahum Sokolov, who is the president at that time of the World Jewish Congress, and he says, don't have this illusion that we Jews can afford to go back to the medieval ghetto. Our Zionist principles have two parts: Eretz Israel and equal rights in the diaspora. 2 minutes? Great. So I will skip to the end. The question is what all that means. I had a set of questions that I will not have time to share with you. I will just tell you that it was a completely different discourse when this discourse was applied to Europe and when it was applied to the so-called ghettos of Jews in Arab countries. I would also let you know that when it was translated, this very discourse into the discourse of the leadership, the Yishuv leadership, whose main concern was mere existence of the Yishuv, it got a very different meaning from the one in Europe. And finally, the last thing, when you put all this discourse in general modern Jewish context, the main question that you have to ask, and I will, with your permission, will not answer it, but I think because the most important thing is to ask the question. It's not optimism against pessimism, whether we can even think of equal rights among the non-Jewish majority. And how do we see this struggle from the Yishuv perspective? It's much more complex. The optimism here is whether Jewish normality, I'm not talking about assimilation, can be at the same time Jewish belonging to the Jewish nation or to the Jewish collective, and at the same time also Jewish belonging to the non-Jewish surrounding outside of the ghetto, the so-called ghetto walls. This is the main question, and this is where this question become very complex. Most interesting, how the Yishuv react to this idea of simultaneous belonging to both the Jewish collective and the non-Jewish surrounding. And here I have to tell you, until 1939, until the Holocaust, the answer is that there is a lot of identification with that notion. And if you want to understand what the damage that the Holocaust caused, you have to read the very different newspapers of the Yishuv after 1939, how this notion was completely erased, completely missing. But this is another research. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll adopt Ira's local habits. We'll take 3 remarks and then 2 turns. We'll have like 20 minutes, and that should be quite enough for us. So we'll said I meant we'll adopt Shabbos habits. So we'll begin with Ira, then Vina, Kobe. Okay.
Thank you all 3, but for Ben, granted that this is a preliminary stage in your investigation, have you looked at France's Légion étrangère, the Foreign Legion, which was an institutionalized part of the French army that accepted foreign citizens into the French army, and the reward for good service in the Légion étrangère was French citizenship. So there may be some aspects of the Légion étrangère that may be relevant to your investigation. Now to Ofer, that was really a very rich presentation, and there is much, I can see there is much under the surface. And I want to just ask one technical question and throw out an observation. The technical question is, in the Yishuv newspapers, what sources do they use for their stories from, for instance, Poland? Do they use Jewish Telegraphic Agency? Does Davar have a correspondence in Warsaw? Do they get it from the Polish Yiddish press, Heint, Moment, etc.? That's the technical question. The larger issue, of course, is who coins the term ghetto. And it seems reasonably clear from what I'm hearing from you that it is the Jews who do this, and this goes together with documentation from the Nazi side. Nazis don't talk about ghettos. They talk about jüdisches Wohnbezirk, a Jewish, in Warsaw there is a Jewish residential area. They don't call, the Jews call it the Warsaw Ghetto, or the Lodz Ghetto, or the Riga Ghetto, or whatever. And this is how it comes into history. But this is it seems to me, jumping off what your observation, that this is an important Jewish coinage with all kinds of interesting implications.
Mina. Thank you very much to all three panelists. A quick comment to Ben and a continuation of our discussion. Just, I think, to keep in mind possible distinction between state and nation. Not all countries are necessarily nation states in their self-perception. So in thinking about the predicament of these soldiers coming from a country, say like Canada or the US, that has a particular model of citizenship and of the relationship of the state to its citizens, as possibly different from Israel, keep that in mind in the way possibly those questions are framed and what you want to get out of them. And there'll be the whole question of maybe getting them to think about something that they're not as fully aware and self-reflexive about, and that might pose other methodological questions that you're getting ideas into their heads in getting to think about that. And my question to Ofer, very interesting history that I'm not very familiar with, but that resonates with my own research on Jewish Canadian writers and how they represent Israel. And my talk on Sunday very much about a sense of crisis that they have, where their understanding, the secular kind of Jewish Canadian writers, the understanding of their Jewishness, kind of, which is secular, encapsulated by this notion of tikkun olam, but tikkun olam viewed very much in the tradition that you seem to describe here of the Yishuv in the 30s, where the emphasis falls on human rights. So they see their Jewishness as ultimately encapsulated in a universalist kind of humanism. And they all come to Israel and have to contend with what happens once you have a state that is a nation state, where there is this kind of ethnic democracy and so on. So when you say the Yishuv in its self-perception sees these two Zionist principles, Eretz Israel and equal rights in the diaspora, it begs the question, how are they viewing equal rights in the Yishuv?
First, I must apologize. I was teaching this morning and yesterday also in the Sheva, so I didn't hear many of you, but I heard the last comments Ofer you made, and perhaps my question is not has already been answered by you, but I was thinking about the title of your talk mentions the different attitudes, different separate agenda, and perhaps it was part of your lecture and not in the concluding remarks, but I assume that there is, to a certain extent, a separate agenda. I heard what you say in the last moments, but I thought that one interesting thing is to try to find out how this separate agenda, how these perceptions of the events that took place in the 30s in Europe, how do they change the self-perception of the people in the Yishuv, especially with regard to the way of how do they see themselves within the context of Arab countries, within the context of the Middle East? Is there a contact here between perceiving the situation of the Jews, the numerous clauses, for example, in the 30s, as you said, even before 39, and the way they think about themselves here in Palestine at that time?
Well, I had a question to Tal. Oh, sorry. No, I'm just, not in order not to call you Tal, I start with the Tal and then I get stuck with the I was from kibbutz Tal, so that's my background. So Tal-Or, one of the things that struck me in your presentation is when I was looking at it and I was asking myself, after all, film is the most potentially not necessarily artistic art in a way. When you think of it, we use photograph. I'm referring to photographs. We use photographs not only on a personal level, but also to document our daily lives. Photographing is part and parcel of media, of public discourse, of creating national emphasis. So in a way, photographing has a potential of bridging between arts and the rest of our life dimensions. So assuming what you demonstrated, that there is a flow of influences and ideas back and forth, I wonder to what extent you can see, when you look at the roles of many of these, some of these photographers in the public domain, and how they shaped our collective identity as Israelis. To give just two examples, the Eilat flag that you showed, photograph, and of course the famous photographs of the parachutes and the hotel. To give just a few examples, I wonder to what extent here you can see something that is Israeli rather than universal or international. Your opinion. Yeah. So we'll let them answer, and then we'll take a second. You want to add to this? Okay, Avi. No, add. Yeah, please do. No, I just said we'll do 2 hours, but do. If it's connected, do.
It's not connected.
Okay. Let them answer, and then we'll do a second, okay? Yeah, go ahead.
So it will be quick because I agree with all the comments. So first, the foreign religion, I think it's an example of what we call traditional or conservative ideas of citizenship, is that serving in the military is a path to citizenship. If you serve in the military army, in the French army, whether it's of course the foreign legion, you will have access eventually to French citizenship. And we can see it all over still today in many countries, even in Israel. If a non-Israeli dies in the army, his family would get citizenship. Now it's in the law, but it doesn't happen because non-Israel, you have to be a Jew to serve in the army, and Jew get citizenship anyway. They don't need to die in order to get Israeli citizenship. So it's like a line that doesn't really apply to no one, but still, or in the United States, many countries have this path to citizenship, like foreign legion. Regarding being the state and nation, that there is a difference between what we call citizenship and nationality. I'm aware of that, but as I said, this is a current understanding that it doesn't have to be together. You can have a citizenship without a national, which is not attached to national belonging, and this is exactly what I want to ask, to see with those soldiers whether they make this differentiation or not. And for the methodological, I think it's very important what you mentioned, that to be sure that we are not putting their my ideas into their thoughts. Maybe they didn't think about it. I'm not sure, but this is exactly what I want to ask. So methodologically, I think I should do like what's called open interviews or semi-structured interviews, which means that I'm not asking them specific question. I'm just asking them, tell me about your experience in the army. What does it mean to you? And they will tell me the meaning. I'm not. I will follow what they are suggesting. Thank you.
Okay. First, thank you for all the three that asked questions. I mean, they're really perceptive, and I'm not sure I have good answers, but I'll try. So Ira first. about the sources. Where do they get the information from? First of all, I have to tell you that as you asked that, I realized that I didn't do it systematically. I can ask you, and it's a good idea for me to really to map it and to give you also a systematic answer, and I don't. I just know that they do take it from the Jewish Telegraph and Polish newspapers. I mean, sometimes you will see that it's a quotation from a Polish newspaper or from a Jewish one. Sometimes from correspondence between people in the Yishuv that they will say that he got such a letter. I mean, there are all kinds of columns of independent writers in the Yishuv press, and there are also Jewish shlichim, whether they are from the Yishuv or from the United States, and they some of their reports they would quote in the Yishuv press. Some of the information they get also from Western press, especially around the Nuremberg laws. So, so they will quote it. But the idea to map it, the sources, where do they get information? I think it's very important, and thank you for that question. About the fact that the ghetto is a Jewish term, I agree completely. It's a Jewish discourse. And to me, it's very important. Jews define this policy of discrimination as ghetto policy. And there is a lot to think about it. I mean, first of all, it's built into the whole idea that ghetto becomes in the modern period as something that is not part of the normative expectation of how you define your place within non-Jewish society. And interestingly enough, after 39, even before September 39, before the breakout of the war, you see less and less in the Yishuv press mention of ghetto benches policy, so much that in 41 there is none. And I found one mention of ghetto benches policy in France, and there it's a quotation from a reporter in London about ghetto discrimination between Jewish merchant and non-Jewish merchant in some market in France, in the Vichy part of France. And the Yishuv, the writer of the Yishuv who gave the quotation, he had a note. He said, of course, they don't mean real ghetto. They mean a discrimination policy. That means that very quickly, with the establishment of the ghettos the Nazis ghetto, the whole idea of ghetto as a discrimination policy was gone. And so it's really interesting, and thank you for the question. Dina, yes, I agree completely. It's a question to ask there. And the easy answer would be that, yeah, all those Yishuv people that supported Arab rights and stuff like that, also supported Tikkun Olam and supported the struggle of Jews for, let's call it, hyphenated identity and whatever. But the fact is that also the right-wing Jews in the Yishuv supported it and identify with that policy. And there is a real question there. And I think the answer there, a very general answer, not a good enough answer, is that I did a comparison between how they treat the ghetto phenomena of what is happening in Europe and what is happening at the same time in Arab countries, Morocco, Iraq, Syria. And the sense is that you have to be cultured enough to be considered as part of this idea of hyphenated identity. Otherwise, if you are not, you read the description of ghettos, so-called ghetto, because they were not called ghettos in the Arab countries, but in the Yishuv they are. They call them ghetto. Again, a Jewish discourse era. They call the Malach and all those ghettos in the Yishuv first. And there, it's a clear separation between Jews that are assimilated and those Jews who are enclosed in the ghetto, and big gap between them. And both of those poles are described negatively. It's only in Europe that they have this continuum of a collective that you can move on that continuum from assimilation to Jewish self-conscious. And what I get from that is also applied to the Arabs. I think there is a sense of progress. We are part of progress, and if you are part of this world, you can talk about Tikkun Olam, you can talk about hyphenate identity, you can identify with. If not, you can maybe save them. But it's a very different discourse. It's not a good enough answer, but it's a beginning. Kobe, what you said about different agendas, I also looked for that, and what I did, I did a quite deep analysis of the discourse against the white paper of 39. Surprisingly enough, you read Ben-Gurion, you read all the Yishuv leaders about this struggle against the white paper of 39, and they use the same discourse of equal civil rights, the same discourse of the ghetto benches, but they mean completely different things. And that is what happened when you translate the agenda of European Jews to the agenda of the Yishuv. There you clearly can see Ben-Gurion had a very famous article called The Evil Book, Sefer HaMa'al. And there he says, after he talks about the danger that the British try to enforce us to become a minority with non-equal rights to the Arab majority, he says the danger is, the threat is being a minority, not only in Israel, but everywhere. So here you see, and if until 39, until 38, you see both agendas. You could see a real identification with the agenda of the Jewish minority within the non-Jewish majority, side by side, by a quest to become a majority, side by side, by seeing the reality of minority as a danger. 38, 39, and so on, you find only one agenda in the issue, seeing minority per se as a threat, as a danger, as something unacceptable.
Thank you, Ofer. Tal, please.
Tal-Or.
Try or, and then Tal.
So I'll first address the film or photography is not necessarily an artistic medium. I would argue that through things like composition and intent, an argument can be made for photography as an artistic medium. So that being said, if you give two people the same camera and ask them to photograph the same thing, they're not going to have the same picture. And so I think that with that kind of in mind, an argument can be built for photography as an art form or a medium of expression. And that has more to do with intent in the way people speak about photography. And I think that's what's unique about the 1960s in America and the 1970s more internationally, is the boom in photographic education in post-secondary institutions. And so with that education, you get the more classical art understanding of, and by that I mean painting and sculpture, of some form of credibility as an artist. So you receive a certificate from a school that says you have been trained in this medium, and then therefore you are an expert and you are an artist. And recognition also gets received from the networks of people working within the field. So exhibitions are made, publications are made of the work. So there's this kind of marketplace that supports photography as an art form, and that really becomes dominant in the 1970s on a more international based level. As far as the Israeli versus international aesthetics, or styles, I should say, I think that there's a struggle with that even with my research right now, focused on Canadian and American. There is a blurring between how you would define Canadian and American, and obviously they're much closer together, but in the history of photography, there seems to be these kind of emerging pots of specific stylistic approaches, so like the Bauhaus, for example, which then quickly get co-opted or move internationally. So the Bauhaus, for example, becomes the Rhode Island School of Design quickly after leaving Germany. And many of those teachers actually come to America due to various forces, but largely the Nazi rise in power, and reconstitute the school and then educate people to value that specific style, which therefore reinforces the production of the style. And so in the case of Israeli photography, every wave of immigration brings whatever aesthetic or style was produced in that region to Israel and reproduces it within Israeli society, or at least that's the trend that has been documented thus far. But then there are things like international influences, like journals, publications, magazines, exhibitions, and like specifically the family of man, because I think that a huge trope in Israeli photography is the use of photography in dissemination of forms of propaganda or documentary photography or some way, and propaganda not necessarily in a negative means, but just in the sense of trying to disseminate your own opinion about a subject matter. And Karen Kayemet L'Israel, they all had these specific views of how photography should be used as this kind of neutral documentation, which it was not. It was photographed in that specific style. And that was largely influenced by the very successful exhibition of the Family of Man, which started at MoMA in 1955 and traveled internationally. So with that said, I have no idea what I would define it as Israeli photography. I think that research still remains largely needs to be done, and I think a part of that is also what I have access to as a researcher researching Israeli photography abroad is publications produced by Israel, which are largely influenced by the marketplace, which is influenced by American understanding of photography. And also photography in Israel and defining what Israeli photography may be. For example, from the early days of photography, like right after photography is invented, they send photographers to come document Israel or Palestine at the time, and they're documenting it in a specific way that enforces the notions of biblical understandings of the Holy Land. Right, so does that count as Israeli photography? Which is the other thing is 1970 is the first generation of people born under the state of Israel, right? So it's different than saying that people who are in Palestine, like prior to that point, did they also count as Israeli photography? So all these questions are kind of something that, so I don't have an answer.
Anyhow, so we're getting closer to the time. We'll skip the second round. I'm sure we can discuss the questions over lunch, as we did in the last 2.5 days. And I invite you to all come and eat. Good food.